Okay, you able to hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so just because some of you are new, just briefly, in years past, from about 1978 to 2004, I worked in the state's child welfare system when it was under different name and everything. I worked 17 years in Spokane and as a CPS caseworker, then a supervisor, area administrator. Came over to the west side in 1995, ran the training center for a couple of years, and I was a regional administrator in Region 6 for the last 7 years that I was with the agency. And I went to the University of Washington School of Social Work for 5 years, ran a training and resource institute there, taught in the MSW program. Then I worked for Casey Family Program for 6 years and retired from there in 2016. And then the next 7 or 8 years, I did training in child welfare. And just this last year, my contract has ended there after 8 years of doing training. So anyway, that's briefly the background here. So I've had an interest in placement instability for, many, many years, and primarily because this is one of these issues in child welfare that is structural. And because it's structural, which I'll say more about that in just a second, it's very difficult to resolve it. In the same way that homelessness in, very affluent West Coast cities is structural. And so for that reason, very, very difficult to resolve it. I mean, so people end up sort of throwing up their hands and saying, we spend a lot of money, we do all kind of programs, we help a lot of individuals, but somehow in the aggregate, the situation doesn't seem to get any better, and maybe it even gets worse. And that's when you have a structural issue, that when you do programs that don't address or sort of take the structure for granted, the structure just sustains itself. And you end up with a situation over and over again. Well, the structural issue in child welfare is that the public agencies are operating with a volunteer foster care system for the most part. And so what that means is that foster parents are compensated, sometimes not even at 100% of cost, but they're compensated for cost of care to some extent or other. And some foster parents receive supplemental payments for taking kids to therapy and stuff of that sort. But it's not a paid cadre of foster parents. And that's even true when you have foster parents who work in therapeutic childcare programs. So many, many excellent foster parents, but structurally speaking, that situation has always been the case for the last 40 years that I've worked in child welfare, and it remains the case. And one of the things that I have found in recent years, I write monthly sounding board commentaries every month. I put them out, I disseminate them. And I've written a lot on foster care, and generally speaking, and I have been an advocate for professional foster care now for 20 years or more, I just don't get any traction. I mean, I can write these summaries over and over again, and I just don't get much of a response. I mean, every once in a while, someone will send something saying they agree with me or something, but for the most part, people just ignore it because they don't really think that foster care systems around the country are going to do that. And for the most part, policymakers don't even really kind of debate this. So they just sort of we have the foster care system we have. It's a volunteer foster care system. What that concretely means, of course, is that people come in, they can drop out. Some foster parents come in and they drop out of foster care without ever having a kid. And a lot of foster parents come in and they want, they really come in to get babies or have babies placed with them, hoping to adopt. And sometimes they're sort of convinced or maneuvered over time to take other types of kids who have behavioral problems. Sometimes that really does happen. And then, of course, you have a high dropout rate in foster care. So you probably, in past years, this state was losing more than 1,000 licensed foster parents a year. So the reason it's always been hard to increase the number of foster homes in this state is that because the dropout rate is so high. You had to have 12 to 1,300 new homes every year in order just to stay even in terms of numbers. So if anything, just to tell you kind of where that's gone, I left the agency in 2004. When I left the agency, at that time, there were 6,000 licensed foster homes in Washington. Today, there probably aren't more than 4,500 homes, maybe, But of course, the number of kids in foster care has gone down, and it's gone down a lot. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Well, one of the reasons, of course, that a variety of reasons why there have been reductions in foster care, but one of those reasons is that foster care has really a bad rep, and it's increasingly bad in recent years. And a lot of that has to do with issues around the inability to stabilize behaviorally troubled kids in care. Now, this isn't the only issue that has some connection to placement instability, but it's an issue that I'm going to focus on here today. So you end up with lots of kids who have behavior troubles when they come into care, and it's hard to stabilize those kids in care. Most of those are school-aged kids. Not all of them are. Most of them are. And the ones that then began to move around in the system, and that's at least a third of the kids. I mean, it might even be a little bit more. It's not any less than that. Of course, their behavior problems then are getting worse in care. I mean, foster care is actually harming them developmentally a lot of the time, because the foster care system's not able to stabilize them. And so you end up with kids actually after maybe 2 or 3 years in care who, look dramatically worse than when they entered care. So that's sort of the background of the thing. You have a foster care system that's not set up, not developed, not financed, not staffed to deal with the behaviorally troubled kids in care, which is about, just to simplify, about half the kids. It's not all the kids, it's about half of them. And again, to say this again, it's mostly in the school age range. I mean, with the kids between 6 and 17 at entry into care, but to a certain extent, there's some, younger kids as well. Now, what's happened in this state in recent years and all over the state is that in addition to this issue, the issue around behaviorally troubled kids in care being moved all over the place because no one is willing to stick with them, given the nature of their behavior problems, you end up with foster care shortages here, so that lots of kids now who come into care in recent years are being moved frequently in the first few weeks or month of care. And this includes very, very little kids. I mean, this can include infants, toddlers, kids in the 0 to 5-year-old age range, who there just isn't a place for those kids when they come into care. And you even we've had a sort of a horrible thing in recent years where in some regions of the state, kids have been moved very frequently from home to home on a 24-hour basis. Moved from home to home on a 24-hour basis. Well, of course, how could anyone believe in a foster care system or have confidence in a foster care system that operates like that, where you don't have places for kids coming into care, so they're moved all over the place? And, in some of those 24-hour placements, I mean, those of you who are experienced have probably run into this from time to time. The agency sometimes will enter into contracts with foster parents to take kids for $300-400 a night, maybe even a little bit more, and don't even serve the kids dinner, don't serve them breakfast. Kids show up there at 7 o'clock at night, they leave at 6 or 7 in the morning. They're not even served a meal. And kids who come into care, and this is kids who don't even have behavior problems a lot of the time. So that's what happens when foster care systems have these acute and chronic shortages that have happened in recent years, right? And so that's kind of part of it. And part of the reason that, just to state an opinion, my personal opinion, is that the agency, policymakers have been slow to respond to these issues, is because I'm not actually convinced that they actually want to improve the foster care system. I think that, some policymakers, I think a lot of advocates actually would just like the whole thing just to fall apart. I mean, because then you couldn't put kids in care. Why would you want to? And so there's always been some resistance to investing more in foster care, and to improve the systems, you have to invest more in various ways, because the fear is that if you have a better foster care system, you'll end up with more kids in foster care, people for various reasons, not just for child maltreatment. will want to put kids in care. So there's always at some point, despite kids being in hotels, sometimes in past years sleeping in offices, 1 year even sleeping in cars and so forth, right? So at the front, there a reluctance to actually deal with those issues, despite many verbal promises to do so, because of a concern about, well, what would that mean if we start reinvesting in residential care, which people, by the way, in child welfare, are a very, very bad rep, and for really some really good reasons. So a disinclination to make those kind of investments, and yet you end up in this situation then that just goes on and on and on with the hotel placements. And now, of course, in King County, there's a facility that is staffed by DCYF staff that takes kids sort of like hotel placements. And it's very difficult to get information about what actually goes on in that facility. So I don't really have much information about it other than I know that it exists. And I know that it has been used to reduce hotel placements in King County. So here you have sort of a range of issues. You have the front end issues that have to do with shortages. And that seems to me that those are very resolvable issues. Those aren't what I have described before here as structural issues at all. Those really do have to do with policy. They have to do with level of investment. It's very possible to resolve those things, right? So in past years, for example, the state had, when I worked for the agency, we had receiving homes that were on retainer. So we had foster parents that were paid regardless of whether they had kids, so that they would be free or available to take kids on an emergency basis, on an as needed kind of a basis. So during some of the budget cuts that happened then over the last 15 to 20 years, all those receiving homes were completely eliminated. So, I guess what I'm saying is all the shortage thing here, that's totally a function of recent policy errors and mistakes. And it had to do partly with issues around budget. It partly had to do with issues around just a dislike of residential care. It had to do partly with federal policy. I mean, it had to do with a lot of different things, but it's a self-inflicted wound. I mean, it's not something that is caused by the federal government. It's not something that is inherent to the system. As I have argued, that placement instability for behavioral reasons, that's, as I've already said, that's structural. And for that reason, that's very, very hard to resolve. But these front end issues, those are very kind of resolvable kind of issues here. And so there have been so many promises made by the leadership of DCYF and also by policymakers in recent years that I've given up listening to words. I mean, I don't care anymore kind of what they say, particularly in press releases or in media stories and whatever. I just look at their actions. I just look at what they do, and they haven't followed through on any commitment over the last, since DCYF has been in charge. And I don't blame that all on Ross Hunter or the leadership. I mean, partly that has to do with the legislature, that has to do with funding issues, so that the two groups are kind of connected there. But it seems like to me that at the very least, we would hope that kids would be, who enter care, particularly the younger kids, they would be stabilized very, very quickly. Now, there has been over the years an issue around moving infants around in care. So I'm going to say a little bit about this before I launch into the discussion of behavioral issues and so forth. So some of you have heard me say in past trainings that about a fifth of the kids who enter foster care in Washington and nationally are infants in the 0 to 1 category. Probably almost 50%, maybe 45, 50% are in the 0 to 5-year-old age range when they enter care. And so that particular group, and a lot of those kids, by the way, are entering care for reasons with which you're very familiar as causes. I mean, because of drug, alcohol kind of issues with parents, because of chronic mental health concerns, and some of the parents who have issues around domestic violence as well, and a lot of the, so very, very troubled families there. And so one of the things we know about infants entering care, for example, is that the reunification rate for infants is way, way less than it is for kids who enter care even at 1 year of age. So, probably, I don't know, in past years, I don't know what it is the last year or two, but in past years, probably close to 60% of kids who entered care as infants ended up being adopted. That is, the reunification rate for infants in this state has not been very high over the years. And also for infants, there is the issue of when they are reunified, then both in this state and nationally, they've had a very high rate of reentry into care. And so that's also a concern, much higher than the rate for kids who are older at that time of their first entry into foster care. So one study, for example, that came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and this was a national study that looked at reentry into care rates in maybe a dozen states or something that around the country, found that more than a third of the kids who first entered care as infants and who then were reunified with their parent or with their parents, then re-entered foster care. And most of them re-entered foster care within a year or two. So, and compared to maybe a quarter of all the other kids, I mean, so much higher rate of reentry care for infants. So given the fact that infants enter care in a tremendously vulnerable group of kids, and as I've explained before, in terms of child fatality numbers and both in child maltreatment deaths and deaths from disease and so forth, really important to stabilize those kids in care. And foster care systems in recent years have even had trouble in doing that. They frequently had trouble in stabilizing infants in care. And so when you don't stabilize infants in care, you affect their development from the first days of life. And so, one of the most distressing studies that I saw, this study came out in 2008. So you wouldn't say it's a recent study, but there's no reason to believe, from my standpoint, that the results, if we did it today, would be any different. There was a study of opioid-exposed infants in 4 states, and this was not one of the states. So the states were mostly in the Midwest. But this particular study tracked infants who were identified as drug exposed at birth, and they were divided into 3 groups. And some of the kids went into foster care, about a third. Some of the kids ended up going to relatives, usually without court orders, on a sort of an agreement kind of basis. And some of the kids ended up staying with the mothers. And so then the study tracked developmental outcomes over a 3-year period of time. And by the way, the lead author in this study was Bada, B-A-D-A. This study is available online if you're interested in it. And I sent information about this study and maybe last year to Ryan. I mentioned it, and so I can do it again. But anyway, the short version of this is that in terms of developmental outcomes for those kids, the kids who went into kinship care from the hospital did by far the best in terms of development. Why is that? They were stabilized in care, as opposed to the kids who ended up going into foster care, who were frequently moved in care. That was one issue. But the other issue with kids, with infants going into foster care, is that sometimes they're placed with other babies. So they're placed in overcrowded situations. So ideally, you only want 1 infant in a home. You don't want 2 or 3 infants in a home, or 2 or 3 little kids in a home, because, of course, what infants need is they need caregivers that have an emotional surplus. Why does poverty, for example, have such a tremendous impact on the very, very youngest kids, right? Because the issue of material hardship is related to the issue of emotional surplus. People who have to struggle hard to survive really a lot of times don't have much left over emotionally to give to the very youngest kids, and they need a lot of that emotional surplus kind of thing. So stabilizing infants in care, very, very important. And so what this beta study found is that the kids who were in foster care didn't do any better developmentally than the kids who stayed with those drug-using moms in a developmental way. And that had to do with, again, with the stability issue. So we want to stabilize the infants in care as soon as we can. And once we start seeing infants moving around in care, wow, There just needs to be, a wake-up call, a meeting about what are we going to do about this? Now, in terms of the behaviorally troubled kids, this is like, I've already said this, a lot of these kids are school age. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are. And so what do we know about those kids from sort of national kind of studies? So the studies that I depend on are called NSCA studies. And so there's this NSCA stands for National Study of Child and Adolescent Well-Being. So there have been 3 NSCA studies. There's one that's going on now. So they take national samples from kids who have open child welfare cases and around the country. So this is the reason that I like the NSCA studies, because they aren't from a single state. They have a kind of a national kind of a sample kind of thing there. So the main finding from those NSCA studies in past years was that, remember, about half the kids who enter care come in with behavioral issues. Not all of them, but about half of them. Okay, the ones who come into care with behavioral issues are more likely to be moved around in care. So, their rates of placement instability of moves are going to be higher. That's just kind of a given there. And so what the NSCA study found, the most distressing finding, was that for the kids who came into care with a sort of a level of behavior problem that would, reach a threshold where they would be referred for treatment, for those particular kids, every single subsequent move hurt them developmentally. Every single move hurt them developmentally. And of course, it really matters. And this is for those of you who, have some of these kids in care now. I guess I do want to say that while for that group of kids, every move may hurt them, particularly the moves that they interpret as rejection hurt them. So this is how really foster care systems can do kids a lot of harm here. So if kids come into care and already with histories of maltreatment, and then they are subjected to subsequent rejection at the hands of multiple caregivers, then of course, what do we think is going to happen to their behavioral issues and their ability to function in school and so forth? Generally speaking, it's going to get worse. So one of the issues here that I want to focus your attention on is just not whether kids move or don't move, or how many moves they have, or as important as those issues are, it's also very important is how kids move, how they are prepared for moves, what people say to them about moves, how they interpret the meaning of those moves. And so particularly when you have emergency placements, and when caseworkers call up an agency and say, when a foster parent says, I want this kid out tonight or tomorrow morning or something like that, I mean, that's doing overt harm to kids. And so it's been very hard with, of course, using voluntary foster parents who aren't a lot of times really trained to deal with this group of kids, even when they don't succeed with the kids. And it's understandable sometimes that they want. So sometimes it isn't so much the move that's objectionable, it's how it's done. I mean, and so it's done in this way that advertises just that I want you gone. And, in past years, this could be putting kids out on a doorstep with a trash bag. I mean, something like that. So when I was a regional administrator in Region 6, this is way back when, but I stopped the trash bag thing. And so there's no excuse for anything like that. But of course, what we want is for foster parents to be trained and supported in a way that even when kids have to move, they don't have to move in that way. They don't have to move where come and get the kid at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and I'll have the bags packed. So you want there to be the chance to have a discussion, a meeting. You want a chance for a little bit, a minimal degree of planning. You want foster parents to be trained to that expectation. As volunteer foster parents, they cannot be held to the expectation, but they can be trained to the expectation that we just are not going to have emergency rejections here. So just in terms of starters there. So Ryan says shared a file in the meeting here. So before I go on, let me just stop there because I noticed there's some comments in the chat box. So before I go on. Okay, so we've developed some placement transition materials for you all. Okay, good. Okay, so the issue of stabilizing, of course, behaviorally troubled kids in care is that many of the foster parents, I think, coming in, they didn't become foster parents to deal with behaviorally troubled kids. They don't, they sort of sometimes maneuvered into it, and the agency having foster care shortages wants them to kind of try taking care of a kid, so a lot of reasons for doing it, but a lot of times without a lot of preparation and just without a lot of readiness for what they're going to confront there. And so sometimes they just, end up having to deal with behavior for which they just are baffled. And so, and not just obnoxious behavior, not just rule breaking, but particularly, of course, the meltdowns. And so kids who have histories of trauma, and that can be abuse, it can be neglect, it can be sexual abuse, it can be exposure to domestic violence. It can be a lot of different things, but one of the, sort of ways that trauma is expressed in child development is by a susceptibility to meltdowns. And so, and I think for those of you who haven't experienced this, these are just kind of maybe abstract words or something, but for anyone who's ever worked in a residential care facility or in a probation and, in some kind of detention facility or, maybe even in a childcare center, anyone who's actually experienced a meltdown is probably going to remember it. And so, because of course, they're very, very extreme events. And I think a lot of times they're very frightening events to people because they just don't know what to do. Don't know how to calm the kid down, don't know whether to lay hands on the kid or not, or what you would exactly do there. And so particularly, I think a lot of the emergency ejections, a lot of the moving kids around in care very, very quickly has to do with sort of the immediate reaction to one of these really, really extreme events. And we can, of course, do a better job of training all foster parents in how to handle the meltdowns of kids. And I've talked about this before in these trainings. And so there are wonderful materials on this subject. You used to have to read books, don't really have to do that anymore. Go online. There's lots of good information out there around how to deal with kids who are susceptible, very stress reactive, very susceptible to emotional explosions. And of course, in kids who are doing meltdowns, those of you who haven't experienced this, I mean, bite, scratch, spit, say horrible, ugly things if they have language, and kick, really, really trying to do harm. So it can be a very frightening thing, and it can be physically frightening to people, but also it can be emotionally frightening as well, particularly the feeling of not knowing what to do about it. What would one do about that exactly if you're not prepared for something like that occurring? So this is sort of tells you a little bit about then, well, what would foster care systems need to do to stabilize more of these kids in care? I mean, even if people don't come in, if they're not self-described as a professional foster parent. And by the way, there's always in Washington State been a group of people who self-identify as professional foster parents. And that's really the only way that foster care systems, in my view, have ever managed at all. You have some people who just view it as a kind of a life vocation. And they really, over time and at great cost to themselves, they've kind of learned how to manage this to a certain extent. And those are the foster parents on whom these systems kind of depend. Well, so one of the things that that group of foster parents have told me in past years is that they learned at great cost to themselves, if they were going to have behaviorally troubled kids in care, then they needed to have psychiatric consultation at their disposal 24 hours a day. That is, it was important for them if they were facing a situation for which they were not prepared and they didn't know what to do about it, they needed to be able to get in touch with someone who was knowledgeable immediately on the phone who could help them. And so everyone who works in a foster care system can keep that lesson in mind. We don't have to wait for there to be some horrible event to set up a situation like that. So every child in care who has identified behavior problems, then if there's a caregiver there, then they should have a person, someone they can consult with who's going to get back to them within an hour. And I don't care what time of night or day it is, they're going to get a return call within an hour. We can set up those kind of arrangements. Let me just stop here before I go any further, before I say more about the behaviorally troubled aspect of things here, and just stop here for a second here. Okay, so going back here to kind of the structural issue kind of here, right? So because there is this group of behaviorally troubled kids in care, and some of them that you're going to come in contact with, or maybe maybe you're in contact with them now. Some of them have already had multiple placements. I mean, they've already been moved from foster home to foster home or into residential care facilities. And of course, over time, of course, that's led them to have very negative views of caregivers, very negative views of the system that's managing their lives, right? And very, very hard to stabilize those kids in care. So what happens with a lot of those kids, of course, is after a sort of a career, so to speak, in foster care, they move into residential care facilities, and then sometimes they're, not only moved around in residential care facilities, but they're actively mistreated in those facilities, even by peers or by staff or so forth, which just makes everything worse. So to deal with this in the long run, really, the idea is that we need a cadre of professional foster parents. And that has been the idea I've had the hardest time in getting any traction with that idea in this state, even though a couple of years ago, the state settled made a settlement agreement with the disability rights group that they would actually develop a group of professional foster parents, which, by the way, has not happened. So another one of those empty promises kind of thing. But in the absence of that, of course, we need therapeutic foster care programs. And a lot of times therapeutic foster care programs take pretty inexperienced foster parents who you wouldn't call them professional foster parents, but they're people who are smart, willing to learn, motivated. They're actually probably able to manage a child if they had the right kind of supports kind of thing there within a private agency type of a program. And so that is the idea that foster care systems around the country are willing to consider, because that's within their current mental framework. They're used to depending on private agency programs. Some of those programs describe or self-described as therapeutic kind of programs. And that has been sort of the main response to the decline in reputation of residential care programs around the country, is try to develop more of the therapeutic programs. This state has sort of in recent years kind of cut the legs out from that by reducing those rates. And so they've driven providers out of business. And so that's sort of like crazy. But so I guess what I'm saying, on a policy level, there aren't that many options. You have to either reinvest in residential care, you invest in therapeutic foster care, you develop a cadre of professional foster parents, or you continue to struggle with this sort of group of kids kind of thing there, right? But in the meantime, given the fact that we have the kids in care that we do, the other alternative is that for everyone who works in these systems or around them, that includes all of you, but it includes foster parents and people in service agencies, it really is possible to get better at trauma-informed care without being a professional foster parent or a therapist or someone like that. Those resources are actually out there. And in a very concrete way, what that means is increasing the capacity to deal with meltdowns and with emotional kind of explosive kind of behavior that is stress reactive kind of behavior. Let me kind of stop there and see if you have a comment or questions here.
I have a question, Dee.
Mhm.
Are there any resources or anything out there, like, especially for relative caregivers, where, if we're not putting the kid in foster care for relative, is there anything that you would suggest being put in place for relatives who are maybe taking the child on during that time to increase stability, their stability?
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things about this. Yeah. So particularly in this state, of course, the main idea that's been in the main, not just an idea, it's a program that's been experimented with over the years, of course, is the hub homes. And those homes, which were created out of a private agency in Seattle way back when, I mean, well more than a decade ago. There would be a group of perhaps half a dozen foster homes that would surround a hub home that would be used for respite care and for foster parent support and so forth. Well, it turned out that those hub homes were very, very good for sibling groups. I mean, that turned out to be that their main sort of benefit was for the sibling groups going into care, particularly for a lot of the relatives, many of whom were older folks and who just needed some time away from those kids and who needed support and stuff. So the idea of having a respite care system, an organized one, where foster parents can ask for respite care on demand. So that would be another crucial element of being able to stabilize behaviorally troubled kids in care better than we have done to date is, if not concretely the hub model, then at the same time having the idea that we're going to arrange respite care on demand, which means that a foster parent can call up and say, hey, I just need a day off here. I just need some help here for a day or two or something. And so that would be one of those elements of a better foster care system. Having an organized system of respite care, ideally through this kind of hub kind of arrangement, but if not, through some other kind of arrangement. And of course, I've already mentioned sort of the psychiatric consultant who is able to be contacted and is going to get back to a caregiver within an hour. An hour kind of a model here, so that people are never going to be left where they're just desperate and they don't know how to, or whom even to contact for help. So those would be key elements. Now, let me say something about issues related to kinship care here. So the main difference in studies of non-kin foster care versus kinship foster care versus unlicensed kinship care. The main difference there in terms of outcomes is that in all of these studies, pretty much, kinship care is more stable than non-kin care. I mean, and so it took a kind of a long time to really find out that. And part of the reason that it did was a lot of the early studies did not control for behavior problems. So it turns out that on average, both in this state and nationally, it's more likely that the kids in kinship care are going to be less behaviorally troubled than the kids in non-kin care. So there's a sort of a natural selection type of process. That is, relatives are more likely to take kids that they believe they can manage and handle and care for over a period of time. And that tends to be the kids who have somewhat less behavior problems. So if you just look at those two groups in most states on average, then the kinship care group is going to be less trouble. But on the other hand, if you go ahead and actually control for behavior problems, kids in kinship care are still going to be on average more stable. And that has been the main advantage for the kinship care placements over the years, right? Now, when I say more stable, alas, I don't mean completely stable, because if any of you who have been a CASA for some years, I would be very surprised if you hadn't had a situation where kids started out in kinship care, and then a few years later, either due to behavior problems of the kids or due to the illness, a lot of times, of course, you're dealing with older relatives, who, as they get older, of course, they become ill or they just have less physical capacity. So you end up with kids who might start off in kinship care, and then by the time they're 10 or 12, they've moved over to non-kin care because the kinship care provider is no longer able to care for them, right? But so by saying that kinship care is more stable on average than non-kin care, I don't mean that it's a total solution to this issue of behaviorally troubled kids in care, because of course it's not, for reasons that I've already mentioned there. But there is nevertheless a strong research basis for the preference for kinship care from the standpoint of stability. And of course, it's also more likely that sibling groups, and particularly large sibling groups, are going to be able to be in the same home compared to the same kids in non-kin kind of settings there. So, but again, this is sort of an averages thing. It's, so.
Dee,
Let
we
me
have a
stop.
question for, yeah, Bill, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, policy changes come very slowly, and I wonder if there's some online resources we could point a caregiver to that would help them in the interim dealing with, like you say, meltdowns or children that are having behavioral problems.
Yes, so I've mentioned before on these trainings, the best single resource on the subject that I found is a book called Nurturing Adoptions by Deborah Gray, and she's a therapist and lives in Bellevue. She retired a couple of years ago, but this book, which every adoptive parent and foster parent really ought to have, very concrete, very, very focused on skills, very focused on practices for helping caregivers deal with kids at all ages, depending on the age of the kid, with a meltdown kind of issue. I have also in the past sent Ryan, and I will do so again. There is a program called Developmental Repair, which was developed in Hennepin County, in Minnesota, which is it's a day treatment kind of program for kids with trauma histories, but it also has lots of great information on this particular subject. And I've written a summaries of that particular program, and I will send that to Ryan. He can send it to you. And you can also look online. Of course, the two books that I recommend, if for those people who still read books, I mean, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog is a great, this book came out in 2006 or 7. Still a tremendous book on this particular subject. I mean, the Body Keeps the Score, the Bessel van der Kolk book that came out in 2014 has, really terrific summaries of what is known about trauma treatment. So all of these resources are good. And then, of course, you can just simply go online now and find a lot of resources there, right? So, but of course, the resource, I guess I'm coming back to this issue of the meltdown, because I think this issue right here is what destroys a lot of placements right off the bat. So starting off with it, thinking in a very concrete way, is you want caregivers, and by the way, not just foster parents, but also school teachers. You want childcare persons, childcare staff to have these skills. Because of course, kids at all ages, from the time they're 2 to they become adults, the particular kids who have the trauma histories, they are subject to these kind of emotional explosions. And so you want people to feel that they know what to do when that happens. Those are very, very extreme events. Those are very, very frightening events. And so you don't want people feeling like, shit, I don't have a clue here what to do. So we're at a point now where no caregiver needs to feel completely clueless, without knowledge or skills in this area, because there's enough resource there. And in addition, that there are lots of skilled people in this state on this particular subject. So this is an area where we want to improve within the current structure, without more enlightened policymakers and all that stuff. We want to improve the foster care system. Then we're going to have heavy duty focus on improving the quality of trauma-informed care there, the kind of helping caregivers to cope with the kind of behaviors that destroy placements, that lead to rejection, that lead to someone to say, come and get this kid immediately because they set fire to my cat or they did something horrible to my kid. or they did, or they blew a gasket and they hurt my wife. And so, we want people to understand how to deal with that. And the resources are there. And so there just ought to be a full court press. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but if we want to stabilize behaviorally troubled kids in care, to me, that's kind of where we start, right there. And then with one other sort of piece of training advice, that is particularly for all the foster parents who deal with not so much the emotional explosions, but just with the oppositional behavior, just the kind of behavior that wears you down as a parent, as a caregiver, day in and day out, dealing with kids who just aren't going to follow rules and directions, and they're in your face about it, and you really, a nonstop struggle to get kids to. So lots of training materials out there in terms of evidence-based practices for how to deal with oppositional kids in a way that makes them behaviorally compliant. All of the sort of the evidence-based programs of the last 10 to 20 years, they use a common set of really, really simple practices. And these are available in lots of different programs, but at basic, the ideas are really, really simple. And the main idea is that you increase the ratio of praise to punishment. Whoever is dealing with a kid, if you want to take an oppositional kid and 6 months later have a kid who's much, much better behaved, then you have to change the ratio of praise to punishment. So lots more praise than punishment. And so it's one thing to say that. Of course, it's another thing to do it when kids are misbehaving or they're behaving in oppositional ways on kind of a regular kind of a basis there. So, but that's sort of the the guideline. And so the evidence-based program, for example, the program for physical abuse, that I'll think of the name of it here in a minute. So a lot of the evidence-based programs sort of coach caregivers how to recognize the kind of behavior you want and just lay on the recognition and the praise over and over and over again until you see more of that behavior, more of the behavior you want. So that's really a simple idea. I mean, it's hard to do it a lot of times without coaching, but it's a really simple idea. So every caregiver, every parent, every teacher, every childcare person can learn that idea at least, and then begin to practice it to the extent that you can, little by little. So to me, the most inspiring programs that I've seen for behaviorally troubled kids over the years are programs that take that principle and then find a way to embody it in some way that is a skill development kind of a way. So the video Mad Hot Ballroom that came out 15 years ago or something, showing a bunch of middle school kids in New York City who their schools entered them into a ballroom dancing contest, and they practiced for months to enter the contest, to see the changes in those kids over a few months. Because of course, why? Because the teachers, the principals, everyone in the school was so into it. They were so on it. There's so much recognition, so much praise. And you start to see the kids, when they do something for which they get praise and recognition that's pro-social, then the kids begin to flower, the kids begin to blossom. And so this is a way also to begin to transform foster care systems for the better. It's hard to get policymakers to pay attention, but these cost some money, but it isn't prohibitively expensive. You just sort of have the idea that we're going to identify talents for every kid in foster care. We're going to invest in those talents. We're going to give kids a chance to shine in something that's pro-social, that people admire. And then they're going to get lots of recognition. And when they do, they're going to be different kind of kids. And so, of course, what's hard about it is that by the time that kids get to early adolescence, by the time they get to 12, 13, 14, and they're on these antisocial kind of trajectories, right? They're just in trouble all the time. They're just getting punished all the time, and for understandable reasons, because they're doing the behavior that people cannot ignore, right? But of course, it's just cementing a sort of a self-identity there that carries on into their middle and late adolescence and into their adulthood, right? So you want to sort of head this off at the pass there. And the way to do it for me is a lot of times you focus on talent development. You focus on something that a troubled kid has an interest in, they can do well, they're willing to practice at, they're motivated to do it, and they're rewarded for doing it. And start to make those kind of investments. So for example, riding horses, for example, that would be an example. Being in a drama club, taking care of animals, dogs, gardening, being great at computer games, even that for young boys. Something that's going to get them a lot of pro-social recognition there, in addition to just making sure that they're in appropriate treatment programs for what their behavioral issues kind of are here. So, now I do want to say we're going to run out of time here, but a couple of other issues about some of these behaviorally troubled kids in care. So some of these kids entered care when they were pretty young. Sometimes they went home and came back into care. So I've already mentioned that reentry into care rates are anywhere from nationally between about 25% to 37% over a period of 3 to 5 years, maybe half of that in the first 12 months or so. So you end up with a lot of kids who have very unstable placement histories in care, who came into care for stuff that was really threatening to them maybe in the preschool years, but now they've been in the system for some time there. And clearly their interests aren't being served by that system. They haven't been able to be stabilized in care. They've even been abused in care. There are some, really, really distressing studies of kids aging out of care in which, according to self-report, anywhere from a third to the half of the foster kids who age out of care claim that they were abused and neglected in care when they were adolescents. A third to a half in some of those self-report kind of studies that have been published by Chapin Hall, right? So for a lot of those kids, particularly in the school age range, where foster care systems just seem at a loss for those kids, I mean, I think a lot of times it's incumbent on everyone who deals with those kids to sit down together and say, are we doing this kid any good by keeping this child in care? I mean, we already know we're harming the kid developmentally. What's happening here for those kids who are being bounced around in care? And I'm talking here about the kids who've been in couple of dozen, 30, 40 placements. I mean, why? I mean, at times it's because there's not the possibility, there's not a caregiver that they could possibly go back to. But for some of those kids, we need to come back and ask the question, is foster care for that particular group of kids doing more harm than good? If there is no alternative, the answer might be yes, there still might be no alternative. I think in those cases, we need to go back and redouble efforts to find relatives, to find someone in the kid's life who will actually take a shot at parenting the kid there, right? Particularly for the older group of kids. Let me stop there, and I see there's quite a few chat things here. Maybe we take about another 5 minutes to questions. So someone says CARES mentors have been really helpful for the families. So does someone want to say something about that? Someone want to say something about the care persons, the mentors?
Go for it, Jen.
Of course, my dogs are barking now. Yeah, I posted a link up in the chat about the Alliance Cares, and they have lots of free training. They have mentors you can recommend families to, and my families have found it really helpful to use that resource just for, I mean, you can look up specific issues and find trainings, and that's been really helpful for them. Another helpful resource, and one that I've participated in is the trust-based relational intervention by TCU. And I know there's a few agencies out there that provide that training. And I believe the Alliance does it a couple times a year as well. It's intensive, several hours over usually weeks or like a long weekend of training. So couple things I've found helpful.
Just one more thing about the Alliance Care folk too. Those work for both foster parents and relative caregivers or just fictive kin. Like they'll talk to anyone. So don't feel like it's just a foster parent resource. In particular with relatives, they're really good. That's kind of their focus to kind of help support relative caregivers. So anytime you got an issue, have your relatives contact those mentor folks.
I'm having trouble seeing some of the chats here. Okay.
You're good. Dee, there's nothing in the chat. It's all
Okay.
people just sharing resources and stuff. So
Do you know of programs to assist caregivers with very high needs autistic children? The answer to that is no, but I'll look around and I'll look for something and I'll send whatever information I find to Ryan.
I'm
Uh,
really wondering if there's anything out there to prepare a caregiver before he gets to their home. I think that's something that has really hindered because these caregivers, when you say special needs, they say, oh, yeah, I can handle that. They do not seem to understand the level of special needs. And so I'm wondering if there's something we can do to prepare these homes beforehand.
Well, yeah, but now that's why I'm saying that I think that all the caregivers in our system, just to say this again, need to be given the Deborah Gray, the Nurturing Adoptions book. They need to actually read this, but they need to read something on trauma-informed care. If not that book, then they need to read The Boys Raises a Dog or another. They need a resource on trauma-informed care. So they kind of need to know what might happen here once they have one of these kids in care, particularly kids who are stress reactive and susceptible to meltdowns, right? I would also advise any foster parent, for example, who's taking a child who's been moved from kind of a home to home, to always go back and talk to the caregivers who had the child before. I mean, just to do some of the common sensey stuff. I mean, to sit down in a meeting with people and find out, well, what were the challenges in the last placement? What actually happened there? So yeah, I think if we're going to do better as a system, then there has to be more preparation up front. I mean, it can't be waiting for the bad things to happen and then trying to somehow, head off emergency placements at that point. I mean, there has to be, so something about respite care can be done in advance. Something about sitting down with what to happen if kids are stress reactive, what actually, how to deal with oppositional behavior, right? And so not just in terms of training programs, but also in terms of an in-home kind of a consultant person. I think those are things that are actually affordable within the current system. Those are not prohibitively expensive. They cost something, but they're not impossible. I mean, we're talking about some of these kids who've been, placed in out-of-state programs for $12,000 a month, $20,000 a month. There's one famous case in this state a couple of years ago where a kid was in care for $37,000 a month, if you could believe that. You could have sent the kid on an around the world cruise on a luxury ship for more than that particular placement cost. So a lot of this stuff, that kind of stuff can be done up front. Now, issues around, are you saying psych resources are available? That kind of depends on whatever community that you're in there. So, for example, if you live in Seattle or you live in Spokane, yeah, I believe psych resources are available? Yes. Do I know what they are? No, but someone could, you can find that out. I think if you live in some of the medium to rural size areas in this state, the answer to that may really be no. And any kind of resource there would have to be an online kind of resource, or it would have to be a Zoom kind of meeting kind of thing. Those kind of things can be organized. That's actually possible to do that, but that takes some work. And of course, someone has to be charged with doing that kind of work. But yes, is it possible to do something like that? Yes, I think it is possible. Now, just to say one more thing, as an example, one of the things we did when I was a regional administrator, and this just wasn't my region, I'm just not giving myself credit for it, but we did this as a state. We used Title 19 money to hire psychiatric consultants in regions, and then every month they traveled to every office in the region once a month. And they sat down and had discussions with caseworkers in the office about the behaviorally troubled kids in care at that particular time. And that was completely paid for by the federal government. If that was possible then, it's possible now. I mean, but that's something that's on DCYF to organize. Someone within the agency has got to organize that, because you have to be able to tap a federal funding kind of a stream kind of thing there. The last piece of advice I want to give you is just how to get, to tell foster parents how to deal with the agency in a little bit more savvy kind of a way. And so particularly when caseworkers or home finders or whatever those folks are called now are reaching out to a foster parent and want them to take a kid. I mean, foster parents ought to have a list of questions that they ask, if they ask the home finder. So for example, am I going to get respite care on demand? Is there going to be a 24-hour psychiatric consultant that I can contact as needed? Is there going to be someone that visit my home on a weekly basis is there going to be money to invest in this child's, either in their treatment, in their talents, and whatever? And before caregivers agree to take kids into care, they can go down this list of needs. If I'm going to take a child like this, then I need X, Y, and Z, right? I would say that for the caregivers who really have an interest, not just on one kid, but in becoming skilled at this, within this current system, the way it is now, they would be very well advised to go to a treatment agency, to ask around and to connect with a therapeutic agency that's really going to support them in some way. I would say now that would probably be the single wisest thing to do for foster parents or for caregivers who have a connection. Now, the status of the hub homes at this point, I don't know the status of those homes. And so that's something that within the next month or so, I will look into this and find out whether these hub homes continue to, exist around the state or not. Ryan, are you informed on this particular subject? Do you know?
Been talking to Holly a little bit about this plan. I know they're renegotiating the contract for those. Yeah, that's about all the further I know.
I think at one point there was a lot of discussion in the legislature about taking that idea to scale, and for various reasons, and I think mostly had to do with cost. Maybe that wasn't the only reason. I think it never really happened in a take it to scale kind of a way. And so there was a time then when some other states in the country, actually made bigger investment than hub homes did than in Washington state, where the homes originated here. So, but even if the hub homes aren't there anymore, the basic idea is still good. That there would be an organized way of providing respite care to people on an as-need weekly kind of a basis. And there really has got to be a way of doing that, if we're going to stabilize the behaviorally troubled kids in care.
I was just adding some of these things that I learned today to our FTDM transition guide that I shared. But I also think too, you guys, as you're looking at relative placements in particular, asking that question, right? Like, who can provide respite care, and just being really upfront with that rather than waiting for the crisis to happen. But just as you guys are talking to relatives, supporting a relative placement, just asking that question, even if they can't be placement, you could say, could you take the kids for a weekend every once in a while, right? Like really simple things like that, so that we can make sure that we don't burn out these caregivers. The other thing I wanted to say about the hub homes too, Dee, I know the Institute of Public Policy did a study on that. I don't know if you were familiar with that. They were not very friendly to the idea of hub homes. Like, the efficacy didn't really turn out to be as hopeful as everybody had thought.
Yeah, and can I just, so one more comment about that, because I am aware of those studies, and I was involved with a study like that when I was at the University of Washington School of Social Work, right? So when you put hub homes up and compared them with therapeutic foster care programs, there really weren't any advantages, really. I mean, that was one of the findings of those studies. On the other hand, if you looked at hub homes compared to putting 4 siblings in 4 different homes, the hub homes had a great advantage there for sibling groups. So the takeaway lesson for me was hub homes were great for keeping sibling groups together and for supporting relatives. They didn't have any marked advantage for the therapeutic foster care programs that were actually well-functioning type of programs. But on the other hand, they didn't cost any more either, because the therapeutic foster care programs are very costly type of programs, right? So I think with that, I'll stop here, and I mentioned some resources that I'll send to Ryan. It won't be today, but it'll be on Monday there, so.
Thank you
Thank
so much, Dee. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you next month.
Okay, yeah, bye-bye.